One thing I love about being a Unitarian Universalist church is that there's this recognition that revelation is not sealed, even though those are sort of strange words. When I think of that phrase, revelation is not sealed, it reminds me that we as UUs are constantly learning. Our faith doesn't seek to understand a particular story or to become familiar and abide by a specific doctrine. Instead, our faith asks us to live in the context of the here and now, to continue to grow in our understanding of the little t truth, to seek sources which deepen our sense of consciously minded selves and increases our spiritual awareness. We find ways to ground ourselves so that we might be agents of peace and justice, pulling from a core of love versus fear and reactivity. We, as a people of the Unitarian Universalist tradition, don't receive mandates from religious leaders who hold high offices. Instead, we work through a sometimes muddy democratic process to create a direction of a progressive faith movement grounded in love and relevant in today's world. If you look at the Unitarian Universalist webpage, you can search for statements of conscience. These are statements that are crafted by single congregations, and then they go through 3 years of study and reflection and action. And in the 3rd year, the statement is brought to the floor at our General Assembly, which is an annual gathering, and voted on by delegates from congregations across the United States and beyond. By the time these statements make it through this process, they represent deeply held values of our faith. In 1999, we voted in a statement of conscience called Beyond Religious Tolerance, the challenges of interfaith cooperation begins with us. And in that document, they provide some historical context in this about our history, saying that the commitment of Unitarian Universalism to religious tolerance, it dates back to the first guarantee of religious freedom in Europe, which was issued in 1568 by the Transylvania king, King Sigismund, who was a Unitarian. Today, we accept others' rights to their own religious beliefs. However, they say in this document, our acceptance doesn't extend to tolerance of actions flowing from those beliefs that violate individual rights and dignity. And acceptance thrives only where mutual respect exists, understanding is encouraged, and dialogue is nurtured among people of different faiths and philosophical traditions. I think we have a fascinating faith tradition. We describe ourselves as a pluralistic faith. Diana Eck, who is a religious scholar, distinguishes between diversity and pluralism. She says, diversity is simply the fact of people with different identities in intense interaction, but pluralism is the achievement of understanding and cooperation. For diversity to become pluralism, she says, it must be positively and proactively engaged. Proactively and positively engaged. The need to accept and understand different faith traditions begins within our congregations. Even in our little congregation, we have Buddhists and Wiccans, atheists, Christians. We have unchurched people and people who were born and bred as Unitarians among us here at MSUS. There may be more variety than that I don't even know of. I think this statement of religious tolerance reminds us that we need to grow beyond the stereotypes, symbols, and somatic barriers that divide Unitarian Universalists from one another. We begin at home, it says, within our own congregations. So what does it require? I think it means that we look at our own selves, we look among one another, and we look beyond our own congregations as we explore our own moral compass and faith. We need to practice here among other beloveds who gather weekly or less occasionally in worship, small groups, or in service to others. And then we need to look beyond our own congregation and learn to be citizens of the world we live in. The northern suburbs and the Twin Cities have a great deal of religious diversity. Its neighborhoods and its schools and its businesses continue to grow in diversity. These are places that, like where I live in St. Paul, they used to be Catholic parishes, but now these are no longer monoculture communities, particularly in terms of religion. They simply don't exist anymore in the Twin Cities. Unitarian Universalist often turns to social justice as a way to advance our 7 shared principles. The 1999 statement says we want to foster cooperation among people of faith as a way of discovering shared values, and that these shared values may become a workable base on which to build a better world. Interfaith cooperation, it continues, it sets a high standard of thought and feeling and action for each individual and each community that by its nature goes beyond the boundaries of self. It invites us to reach beyond ourselves into the world, to confront fear, ignorance, and hatred wherever we find them. It also invites us to reach deep within ourselves to assess our own prejudices. And this work begins by living our principles and thereby modeling what is possible in the broader community. I've spoken sometimes about my time at the UU Seminary, United Theological Seminary, which was in New Brighton. Now it's in St. Paul. I've had the opportunity to do interfaith work around LGBTQ equality, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous rights, environmental action, and calling witness to the pain and atrocities that our community and country has created. It feels like coming together, we've been able to bend the arc towards justice, or at least to tap into a place in the larger society that reminds us that we can be better selves than we are today. I know that some of you come from religious backgrounds that grounded you, and then there was a point at some point in your life when you decided to leave it and to seek a faith community that corresponded more with your core beliefs. I also know that some of you rejected or were rejected by communities of faith, and that has left a bitter pill to swallow. My hope is that those of you who are raised as Unitarian Universalists were given tools and experiences to understand that there are people of multiple faiths in your community that share your values and your desire to create a common good. So here we are, we're at a point where we're trying to consider, will we remain in our Oakley Drive building or sell it? A core of us have looked at alternative spaces and we may use to gather and to continue our core ministries. You'll hear more about that today at noon, so I hope you'll join us. One of the possibilities you'll hear about is the possibility to rent and share a building owned by First Lutheran in Columbia Heights. If we do end up in such a relationship, we'll be called to understand ourselves in relation to a Christian congregation. A few of us enrolled in a 4-part series at First Lutheran called How to Have Better Conversations About Race and Racism. And you know what? The workshop felt much like it does when we gather at MSUS, when we gather to strive to understand and combat racism and our contribution to systemic white supremacy. The shared goal of growth and understanding was larger than our differences. A part of the Beyond Oakley Drive Task Force also toured First Lutheran and was excited about the space. We are mindful, however, that some of you may find being in a Christian environment unnerving, uncomfortable, and maybe even has an element of feeling harmful to you. My hope is whether we end up sharing that space with First Lutheran or not, we can continue to work at understanding the nuances inherent in all faiths, so that we may not just be triggered by one tradition, but understand that there's a great variety within each tradition. Yep, there are definitely conservative elements of every faith tradition, and they are exclusionary, self-righteous, harmful. They stir up fear and prejudice, which divides and deprives and even kills. However, there are progressive parts of every tradition as well. And in Unitarian Universalists can find places with those progressive people of faith around shared values and goals. Communities that prioritize loving and coming to know one's neighbor obviously share a lot in common with us. Communities that find purposes and values that run along deeply held beliefs that range a span of doctrines and worldviews. Faith communities that understand that we are stronger and we are better together versus apart, where instead of building barriers, we are building bridges. The final statement in that, the final paragraph in that statement of conscious of religious tolerance says, Unitarian Universalist Association dedicates itself to the challenges of interfaith cooperation and calls upon its members, congregations, and individual Unitarian Universalists with the dictates of conscience to accept these challenges. May our commitment to building a better world begin with ourselves as we work with others to make the world awaited, a world attained. Lisa read a little bit by Ibu Patel. He's an author who is published by our UU publishing house, Beacon Press. He's the president and founder of Interfaith Youth Corps. If you've not heard him speak before, you may want to look him up in a podcast or go on YouTube and search for one of his public addresses. I heard him once at a minister's retreat and have followed him for years. He talks about cultivating the garden of shared values. Cultivating the garden of shared values. We live in a world desperately in need of our care, and whether that is the care of fellow human beings, the natural world, whether it's other species and institutions, or whether it's the care of democracy. We Unitarians who speak of creating heaven here on earth versus thinking about another life, we recognize that our current lives here are the only ones we've got. We can live it in despair and inaction, or we can lean into relationships and work so that we can make a difference and turn the tide of history. The garden of shared values is where hope and vision grows. This week, I was speaking with a friend of mine who was previously a faculty member at Hamline University in their Department of Religion, and now she leads a Lutheran center at St. Olaf College, which, interestingly enough, is now only 20% Lutheran, even though it used to be a Lutheran college. She told me about a policy statement that was put out by the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, that expresses their faith commitment to interfaith work. The statement was a declaration of interreligious commitment. And within that document, they named the current context that I spoke of this increasingly diverse world and the religious pluralism that I spoke of. A piece that leapt out to me in that document was a paragraph that was under the title of one word, inaction. And it says, another possible response to religious diversity is inaction. For some of us, an encounter with religious differences may seem a distant reality or one that we're not quite ready to acknowledge. We may have limited information or experiences, which can mean we are less motivated to reach out to our neighbors. All of us, they say, have been exposed to stereotypes, which may seem harmless when not acted on or spoken aloud. Yet, they say, in the face of bigotry, such stereotypes are not neutral. They too can be destructive. I think we're all wise enough to understand the danger of narrow stereotypes, yet we can find ourselves believing them and even perpetuating them when it comes to religions that we don't believe. Francis David, who was a UU leader and martyr, is attributed to saying we need not think alike to love alike. And I'd go further to say we need not believe alike to love alike. The ELCA document states that the remedy to inaction is active engagement across religious differences. So here are the 6 actions that the 1999 statement urging us beyond religious tolerance recommends. They recommend that we educate ourselves, that we honor our own internal religious pluralism within our congregations, that we converse with other people's communities, and that we participate in interfaith service projects, that we work for social justice, and that we celebrate diversity. As I think of the history of this church and other UU congregations, we have a history of interfaith connections. Our Whole Lives, or OWL program, was created with UCC religious educators. Both denominations continue to teach that curriculum, to get trained together, and to work with folks across a lifespan around sexuality education. Our congregation and many UU churches have participated in interfaith programs around homelessness and food insecurity. There used to be an interfaith program that had high school kids camping in our parking lot and other places across the Twin Cities in an effort to understand the experience of homelessness. In some years, our religious education program included a neighboring church or a church across the street program that took our youth to worship services of other faith communities. And we've participated in movements connected to justice and in interfaith worship and witness services. I spent all my professional years prior to entering seminary working to support individuals and communities in public schools and nonprofits and higher ed. What I discovered was that eventually it was important for me to not only pull from my own faith as a Unitarian Universalist, but to be able to name it in public as well. So I decided to go to seminary and enter into ministry so I could center my faith and pull directly from its sources, both personally and publicly. I don't know what lies ahead for our congregation. I do know that for me personally, the thought of sharing space with another congregation presents some rich opportunities. So stay tuned and join us at noon if you'd like to hear more about that. But in the meantime, I've recently connected with a new interfaith group called MN, I don't even know how you're supposed to say it, the Minnesota Multi-Faith Network. And their tagline is connecting and supporting multi-faith work to heal the world. Next week, I'll attend a council meeting where we'll discuss their strategic plan and moving forward as a network. The meeting is being convened by the chair, Rabbi Adam Stock Spilker from Mount Zion Temple, which is just down the street from me in St. Paul. Since I started this job, I've been seeking a community of progressive interfaith leaders in the northern suburbs. Hasn't been easy, but I think that this network holds some promise for creating a framework of connections. So I'm curious about, as we move into a brief time of community reflection this morning, I'm wondering about your own growth in this area of interfaith understanding and work in interfaith networks. I'm wondering if you've had experiences on a personal or congregational level where you have been stretched, where you have grown a relationship, where you have built a bridge with other people of faith and faith communities. I'm curious about how you hold inherent differences and how you prioritized shared values, or that garden of shared values that you hope to cultivate together. So I'm wondering if anybody has any reflections on their own lives when it comes to, oh, here we go. Kathy Burek just wrote, oh, that's great, Kathy. Ibu Patel was the Ware lecturer in 2013, and his talk can be viewed on a Vimeo video. Kathy, I'll post that on our Facebook page and connect it to the news from the office when we post this on Thursday. Thank you for that. I know some of you have worked with Indigenous folks in interfaith movements as well. So I'm wondering whether any of you have things you would like to share around that as well.
Lynn.
Just wanted to say that I really enjoyed, Laura, what you had to say. I think interfaith work is just so important. In fact, it's one of the reasons that I'm a Unitarian Universalist, because I'm a Christian, but I love being part of a community where people have different beliefs. And that's how I was raised. I was raised in a family where we were Methodist, Baptist, Mormons, Catholics, and we really had to be nice to each other. So, you know, that was a very rich religious environment, and I would love to see more of that.
Thank you, Lynn.
having spent the last 4 or 5 years now working with a Lakota-led effort, the sort of transcendentalist, environmentalist influences in Unitarian Universalisms resonate beautifully with the basic values of Indigenous people. However, you do need to be aware that there are some things that are different. And so in ceremony, it's preferred that women wear skirts rather than pants. Metal, and for the Lakota people, is not a core element. And so people who wear glasses with metal take them off during worship and remove any other metal objects. And men and women have very different roles to play in Lakota culture, which for a feminist sometimes can be a little grating, I find. And yet that opportunity to see a vastly different worldview than the traditional Christian view I was raised with, and even Unitarian Universalism, which is so heavily based in Jewish and Christian teachings. It's an eye-opener.
Thank you, Kathy. And I do find, I was thinking a lot about the UUs in connection with Indigenous communities. And I was thinking about every time I end up in sort of deep interfaith opportunities, whether it was, we did a Beloved Conversations with a Christian church that is housed at Unity Church Unitarian. And whenever I realize like how UU centric we can become, it's always so humbling to realize, oh, we actually have to be able to step away a bit, you know, from our own idea that our faith is the cat's meow, and understand that there are many ways to come into this world and to have as frameworks that come from deep traditions. And so I always find it super humbling and very educational to be in deep relationships with folks of other faith.
Holly would like to share.
Just a quick note that I haven't done much interfaith at all, but I have through SECA, either the produce drops or the senior grocery thing, which I always represent and wear my MSUS shirt, and just working in the food shelf. And it works, in my opinion, it works if we have a common goal. And that goal was to feed people. That's it.
Thank you, Polly. Beautiful example.
And I see Bruce.
I've had the pleasure to work with Robin Gonzalez, whose husband is very active in the interfaith, I can't think of what else, but I've accompanied her at her church a number of times. And it's wonderful to go there as accompany her and listen to the service and hear how it's different and be kind of tied into it. And kind of, as I'm listening to it, I feel like I kind of get involved with the rhythm of the service and the rhythm of the minister as they go through their type of a sermon.
And her husband is the minister, the minister of the AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's very different.
And then we've gone out to eat with them a few times, and it's been really enjoyable learning about them and participating in some of the services.
Yeah. And Robin's come and sung at our congregation. So, you know, that is definitely a rich seed that could be nourished, and, you know, find a way to at least get some of our folks over there and maybe some of their folks over where we're worshiping. It looks like Roger or Jamie have their hands up.
Jamie, yeah. I work with a lot of Muslims, and I have people who are friends both inside and outside of work who are Muslim. And I've also done a lot of, done some study of that religion. And I find it to be a very, we haven't worked on any projects together, but I find it to be a very practical religion. And even in our culture, if you don't know much about Islam, you tend to still have a negative view of it. but I think there's a lot of generosity also in Islam. And something that combines both that practicality and the generosity is like one of their 5 pillars is about giving charity, but it's always coached in if you are able, because you must take care of yourself and your family first. But then if you are able to do that and have something more to give, that is a requirement.
Oh, thank you, Jamie. One of the readings was talking about being open to the possibility of holy envy. And I love that phrase, holy envy, that there may be folks of other traditions, you may not believe what they believe, but that somehow their faith provides such a structure or a call to be a certain way in the world that it's, you know, it's beautiful. You can envy it. Katie, who's next?
Lauren.
Thank you. I know that many of us have relatives who don't on thing usually means politically, which I think for many of us is even worse than not agreeing religiously. And I don't know what to do about that. I love these people. And so far I've just, I guess, have decided to ignore their religious views and just concentrate on loving them instead of trying to think of good things to say to them.
Yeah.
But
And
I think we all could use some, I don't know, help or wisdom around that.
And it is interesting how in that statement of conscience, they did talk about that kind of, I can't remember what the exact words were, but that it has to, faiths that, you know, sort of find the inherent worth and dignity in others versus diminish that. It is a really hard conversation to have. And I'm not always convinced that when folks are on an extreme, you know, spectrum, whether it's the extreme progressive faith or extreme conservative faith, that there's much room for dialogue. Sometimes it's kind of your strategy, Lauren, that might be the only way to proceed. But thank you for putting that out there. Katie, are we pretty much done, do you think?
I am not seeing any raised hands or additional comments in the chat, so I think so.
Thank you. Well, I know Reverend Diana has spoken about doing some of the neighboring faith, not just for kids, but for adults as well, particularly looking at communities that might worship at times other than Sunday morning. So we could go as a community and have a little pre and post reflection time. So I would look forward to that. And I'm always open to, if anybody's interested in helping form maybe a series of conversations or not speeches, you know, having somebody present about their faith, that we could do that here at First Universalist. So thank you all for sharing. And I think there's some ripe opportunities out there in the future, hopefully.